I want to talk about pronunciation in Latin. This is something that is often both overemphasized and underemphasized, I think. And so I want to address both sides of things. I want to make sure that we neither over nor underemphasize it. So first, I want to speak to the problem where it's sometimes underemphasized. A lot of times when I work with a student who's been studying Latin for a while, I discover that their pronunciation is really, really bad. And what that tells me is that they haven't been asked to work on their pronunciation at all. They've not been set the task of continually reading things out and being corrected as they're reading so that their pronunciation gets better. And yet I know that it's the case that the student was taught the right way to pronounce Latin words and Latin sounds. That's never left out. That's where we always begin, is this is how these things are supposed to sound. But I feel that in a lot of places, for a lot of reasons, that gets left to the wayside. Once you've been shown it, it's up to you to make it important to yourself. And if not, that's not really part of the curriculum, which is going to focus on learning the grammar, learning the vocabulary, learning the idioms, or whatever the case may be. I think this is a mistake. And I always try to correct the pronunciation of students who come to me to get them on the path to pronouncing it well. And the reason why is because language is an oral reality. Language takes place in the ear. And this is a really, really foundational point that we'll talk about in another video. But that's the natural home of language, is in the ear, not even in the mouth. Because language in the mouth is language expressed by the one who has the thought. But the purpose of language is to convey a thought from my mind to your mind across the impossible space that exists between us. And so language in my mouth is incomplete. It's destined for your ears and for recognition in your ears. If it only remained in my mouth, that would be like me making this video and then deleting it. No one sees it. What's the point of making the videos? I might as well just go do something else. So the natural home of language is in the ear, and language develops through how it sounds in your ear. And this is true even for the one speaking. The types of things that we say grammatically, or the types of things that we even think are incorrect grammatically, we follow our ears, and it's to do with things that we've heard before. So if someone says something, you're like, that doesn't sound right. Is that right? Is that the right form of that verb? Because it doesn't line up with our experience. This being the case, I think it's very important not only that we pronounce Latin correctly, but that we be pronouncing it out loud, because we bring our ears onto the table when we do that. And there's a lot of ways in which the ear can be very helpful in your study of Latin. I'll give you just one example. Oftentimes, if I come across a verb as I'm reading, I may ask myself the question, is this a second conjugation verb or a third conjugation verb? It's a very important question because it's going to change the possibility of what tense and mood it is. And so it's going to have major ramifications for the syntax of my sentence to know whether it belongs to the second or third conjugation. Now, there's a couple of ways you can go about knowing the answer to that. One is you can just happen to know and you're good to go. Like video, I know video is videre, and so we're good to go. Another is you can look it up, but that takes time and it takes you out of the process. Anytime you have to look things up when you're doing Latin, when you're reading Latin, it takes you out of the process of reading Latin, takes you out of the language, and it slows you down. And it also can increase frustration, which ultimately leads you to quit. So there's another way that I bring to bear when I see a word and I'm not 100% sure which conjugation it is, I speak the principal parts to myself. So let's say I come across a form like capiat, and I'll say, is that second or third conjugation? Capio, capere, capi, captus. I said capere, which means I think that it's third conjugation. Now that doesn't prove that it's third conjugation because I've been wrong before, but when it comes to principal parts, I'm not often wrong. I've read enough Latin that I have the sound of the principal parts is generally right in my head. And so it's a quick way for me to check what I believe it to be just by saying it. If it were capere, it would be second conjugation, but capere means it's third. Or again, if I see a word like iconis, is it iconis, which would be a third declension genitive, or is it iconis, which would be a first or second declension dative or ablative plural? Right? And I know that it's iconis, iconis means it's going to be third declension. Another way this comes into play is there's a whole class of nouns in the third declension whose genitive singular is in oris, oris. Tempus temporis is an example of this. Now, if that O is short, like tempus temporis, then it's going to be neuter. But if that O is long, like arbor arboris, it's going to be masculine. And so having those words, learning the words with their pronunciation is one way that I can have another more further access to knowing other details about those words. So I don't think that we should disemphasize it. And then another thing is, should you find yourself in a position where you're hearing Latin, whether it's because you're listening to classical music and you're listening to a requiem mass that's in Latin, or you're in a Latin church, or you fall in with some folks who speak Latin and they're talking Latin around you, whatever the case may be. In order to be able to understand it in your ear, you need to be used to the sounds of it. You need to know what sounds right and what doesn't. Where do the accents really go? Are those long or short I's? That sort of a thing. On the other hand, I often see people arguing about the pronunciation of Latin, and we'll argue about things like, obviously, one of the big discussions out there is ecclesiastical versus classical pronunciation, and people put way too much emphasis on this. It reminds me very much of the question of, well, should you learn English with a British accent or an American accent? I mean, there's definitely things at stake. You're going to sound more natural to one group of people and not to another group of people. Maybe you'll think differently about yourself, but it's really the same kind of question. I mean, at the end of the day, there's nothing inherently right or wrong about British versus American ways of speaking English. It's just purely accentual. And so the same thing about ecclesiastical versus classical when it comes to pronunciation. There are other differences between ecclesiastical and classical Latin, and we'll talk about that in another video. But just in terms of pronunciation, it's like choosing between British and American English. But another thing, whatever pronunciation you find, you settle on. Let's just stick with classical for now. There's a kind of pedantry about certain ways of pronouncing things. For example, does the short O imitate the Greek letter omicron or not? In other words, is a long O pronounced os and a short O pronounced os? Right? So when I have something that ends in that short O in Greek, I have logos because it's an omicron, it's a different sound, not logos. Does Latin follow that same sort of thing? Again, how short is the short E? Should I say capere or capera? People will have very strong opinions about this sort of thing. And I want to suggest that that's a bit weird. And the reason why is that we Latinists, right? We tend to think and speak and teach as if there was one right way to pronounce Latin, and this was common across the empire, and everyone held themselves to that standard of pronouncing Latin that way. This is certainly false because it's been false for every language that we ever have a record of. That's not how people work. When people are spread out across an area, they begin to develop dialects, unique ways of pronouncing the language. Dialects include vocabulary differences, but they also fundamentally are grounded upon pronunciation differences. If you think about a whole range of English accents, right? If you could think, I'm not great at some of these accents, but you can think about, that's an Irish accent versus, what's a Scottish accent? I'm from Glasgow, yeah? Or you think about a British accent, a very posh, I say it, this is quite nice. Or you go down a bit of a Cockney accent, like a bit like My Fair Lady, right? You come over to, you get your New York accent here, and down in some parts of the South, we have a very rich Southern accent, which is a little different than this kind of accent, which happens a little bit more up in your mouth. And on it goes as you go around the world with all the English accents. If you think about it, the primary differences in those accents is in how the vowels are treated. And those are also the questions, the types of things we see Latinists arguing about is, well, should this vowel be pronounced this way or that way? Truth is, whichever way you're arguing about it, there's probably a group of people in the Roman Empire at any given period who pronounced it that way. All of the possibilities are probably there. Given how wide English pronunciation is, and given that Latin existed for a much longer period of time, spread out over a comparably large area, if you will. You could argue about that, but let's just say that for native speakers. And that at times there was a great deal of isolation possible, but among different groups, it's certainly to be believed that there were these dialectical differences. And so one of the things that I have to remind myself of when I hear someone speaking Latin differently than how I speak it is to say, well, they're not mispronouncing it, right? As long as they're not getting the length of the vowel wrong, or they're not getting the consonants wrong. If it's just the quality of their vowels differs somewhat from the quality of my vowels, that's going to have to be chalked up to an acceptable range of variation. Now, it'll never vary all the way to changing to English vowels. That's something we always have to be careful of, not to pronounce our Latin A's like pater. Now it's pater, right? But between pater and pater and pater and these sorts of things, that's a bit of pedantry that we don't really get involved with. So between these two extremes, there's a sweet spot. There is the spot of saying pronunciation matters. You should be speaking the language out, reading it out loud, get it into your ear, take advantage of all the resources you have for learning and understanding this language and getting internal to its own sense. But at the same time, let's avoid the opposite extreme of becoming pedantic about the particular nature of some of the tiny variations of vowels, which in fact would probably represent more of a regional dialectical variation rather than a right or wrong way of pronouncing.